Thomas Harper stood in his backyard on a Tuesday morning, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun climb over the distant tree line. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of cut grass and wildflowers. He had been living in his grandfather's restored farmhouse for almost a year now, and every morning still felt like a gift. The property stretched out before him, 5 acres of good land, bordered by old wooden fencing that his grandfather had built decades ago. Beyond the fence to the east was his neighbor's property, a newer wooden cabin owned by a man named Richard Morrison. Thomas had met Richard only briefly when he first moved in. The man had seemed friendly enough, waving from across the property line, but they had never really talked. Thomas took a sip of his coffee and started walking the perimeter of his land, something he did most mornings. It helped him think, helped him plan his day. The fence line ran straight and true along the eastern border, marking where his property ended and Richard's began. Thomas knew this land well now. He had walked every inch of it while restoring the farmhouse, had studied the old property maps his grandfather kept in a metal box. But this morning, something felt different. Thomas stopped walking and set down his coffee mug on a fence post. He looked around slowly, trying to understand what was bothering him. The fence seemed the same as always, weathered wood, still sturdy despite its age. But something was off. He walked further along the line, his boots crushing the grass beneath them. Then he saw it. The old oak tree that had always stood just inside his property line, about 3 feet from the fence, was now on the other side. Thomas blinked and looked again, but the tree had not moved. The fence had moved. Someone had built a new fence, running parallel to the old one, but 50 meters deeper into his property. Thomas felt his heart begin to pound. He walked quickly along the new fence line, his mind racing. The fence was new, the wood was fresh, the posts recently set in concrete. It stretched the entire length of the eastern border, cutting off a significant strip of his land. The old fence was still there, partially hidden by tall grass, marking where the true property line should be. Someone had moved his fence, and there was only one person who would benefit from this. Thomas walked back to his house, his hands shaking slightly. He was not an angry man by nature. Working on the farm had taught him patience, had shown him that most problems could be solved with time and careful thought. But this was different. This was theft. Someone was trying to steal his land, betting that he would not notice or would not care enough to fight back. He spent the rest of the morning searching through his grandfather's papers. He found the property deed, the survey maps, all the documents that proved exactly where his land began and ended. The evidence was clear. The new fence was wrong. 50 meters of his property had been enclosed on the other side. Thomas knew he needed help. This was not something he could handle alone. He picked up his phone and called the county office. They gave him the number for a property lawyer named Sarah Mitchell. When Thomas explained the situation, her voice became serious and professional. "Don't touch the fence," she said firmly. "Don't confront your neighbor alone. This is a legal matter now. I'll come out tomorrow with a surveyor, and we'll document everything." That night, Thomas could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about his grandfather. William Harper had protected this land for 50 years. He had worked it, loved it, passed it down to Thomas with the hope that it would be cared for. And now someone was trying to take a piece of it away. The next day arrived with gray skies and the smell of rain in the air. Sarah Mitchell showed up at 9 in the morning, a woman in her 40s wearing a purple blazer and carrying a briefcase full of documents. With her was a surveyor named David Chen, who carried measuring equipment and a laptop computer. "Let's take a look," Sarah said, her voice calm and reassuring. They walked to the eastern border together. David set up his equipment and began taking measurements, comparing them to the official property maps. Sarah took photographs of everything: the new fence, the old fence, the oak tree that now sat on the wrong side of the boundary. While they worked, Thomas saw movement across the way. Richard Morrison had come out of his cabin. He was a man in his 50s wearing blue jeans and a red flannel shirt. He stood watching them, his arms crossed over his chest. Sarah noticed too. "Stay here," she told Thomas. Then she walked toward Richard, her posture straight and professional. Thomas could not hear what they were saying, but he could see Richard's face change. At first the man looked defiant, pointing at the new fence and shaking his head. But as Sarah talked, showing him papers from her briefcase, his expression shifted. He looked down at the ground. His shoulders slumped. After about 15 minutes, Sarah walked back to Thomas. Richard remained where he was, not moving. He knew, Sarah said quietly. He knew exactly what he was doing. He admitted it. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but Sarah held up her hand. "Wait," she said. "Let me tell you the rest." They walked back toward the house, and Sarah explained. Richard Morrison had financial problems. His business had failed 6 months ago, and he was facing foreclosure on his cabin. He had planned to sell his property, but the lot was small, and potential buyers kept offering less than he needed. In desperation, he had decided to move the fence, hoping to add 50 meters to his property line before anyone noticed. Then he could sell the larger lot for more money. It was wrong, Sarah said. Completely illegal. But he's not a criminal mastermind. He's a desperate man who made a terrible choice. The surveyor finished his work and confirmed what Thomas already knew. The new fence was on Thomas's property. The documentation was complete. Sarah could file a lawsuit, could have Richard arrested for attempted theft. The law was entirely on Thomas's side. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked across his land toward Richard's cabin. He could see the man sitting on his porch steps now, his head in his hands. Police cars would come if Thomas said the word. Richard would face legal consequences, criminal charges, financial penalties on top of his existing problems. Thomas thought about his grandfather's letters, the ones he had found under the floorboards. He thought about regret, about broken relationships, about words left unspoken. He thought about mercy. "Give me a minute," Thomas said to Sarah. He walked across his land past the old fence line toward Richard's property. The man looked up as Thomas approached, his face pale and tired. "I'm sorry," Richard said before Thomas could speak. "I'm so sorry. I was desperate. I know that's not an excuse. I didn't know what else to do." Thomas stood there for a long moment, looking at this man who had tried to steal from him. He could feel his anger, but he could also feel something else, a kind of understanding. People made mistakes when they were afraid, when they felt cornered by circumstances beyond their control. "The fence comes down," Thomas said firmly. "Today. You'll move it back to the proper line, and you'll do it right." Richard nodded quickly. "Yes, absolutely, I'll do it myself. I'll pay for everything. And there's something else," Thomas continued. "When you're done with the fence, come to my house. I've been needing help with some projects around the farm. I can pay you fairly for your work. It's not a permanent solution, but maybe it will help while you figure things out." Richard's eyes widened. You'd hire me? After what I did?" "People make mistakes," Thomas said quietly. "What matters is what they do next." Over the following weeks, Richard took down the new fence and restored the property line to its correct position. Then, true to Thomas's word, he began helping with work around the farm. He repaired sections of the barn, helped plant a new garden, fixed broken equipment. At first, they worked in silence, the weight of what had happened hanging between them. But gradually, they began to talk. Richard told Thomas about his failed business, about his fears of losing everything. Thomas told Richard about his grandfather, about learning to restore the farm, about finding purpose in this place. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, they sat on Thomas's porch drinking cold water after a long day of work. "I don't deserve your kindness," Richard said, staring out at the land. "Maybe not," Thomas replied honestly. "But I think we all need kindness we don't deserve sometimes. My grandfather taught me that, even though he never got the chance to practice it himself." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I won't forget this," he finally said. "You could have destroyed my life. Instead, you gave me a chance to fix my mistake." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's what neighbors should do." The incident with the fence became a turning point for both men. Richard eventually found a buyer for his cabin at a fair price and moved to a smaller place nearby. But he continued to work with Thomas on the farm, and a genuine friendship grew between them. Thomas learned that defending what was his did not always mean punishment in legal battles. Sometimes it meant setting firm boundaries while also offering grace. The land his grandfather had loved was protected, but more than that, Thomas had honored the lesson hidden in those letters under the floorboards. Forgiveness and second chances could change everything. As autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and red, Thomas stood once again at his property line. The fence was exactly where it should be, marking a clear boundary. "But on, Bo,